So tonight we are launching a new series called Holistic Thinking. And I need to give you a bit of a premise for where we're going with this series. And the premise is really simple. If Jesus of Nazareth, if the man of Jesus actually walked the earth, if he actually existed, if he actually lived, died on a cross, and rose to life again, that changes absolutely everything. It's not an idea. If it is a historical fact that Jesus did these things, then every aspect of our thinking is changed. The way we approach the created world in science, in the arts, the way we think mentally, maybe struggling with depression or other mental illnesses, how does it impact that? The way we relate to other spiritualities, and ultimately the way we open up the scriptures and read them. If Jesus is real, then everything about our thinking needs to change to recognize that fact. It can't be an amendment. It can't be just an add-on. It is a fundamental shift in our thinking. So we titled the series Holistic Thinking, meaning we need to learn to think holistically about the person of Jesus. If he's real, it changes everything. So for the next 4 weeks, we're going to try to do that. We're going to unpack different aspects of our lives and say, what does it mean to follow Jesus in this context? Tonight we're starting with science, and this is kind of an interesting one for me because my degree initially is in engineering physics. I was trained as an engineer / physicist. Had the privilege of doing some research as an undergraduate, published a paper, and have kind of actually done some science. Some real, actual science. It was cool. It was one of the coolest experiences of my life. Actually here at Mac, working on the electron microscopes, looking at atoms and wrestling with how do we build more efficient solar cells. But now I also work and serve and lead as a pastor. And so tonight what you're seeing is two worlds of mine colliding in a very real way. Now, I'm not an apologist. I'm not an expert at defending the faith. My dad actually, that's his specialty. So I drew from him and talked this over with him. But what you are seeing is the wrestling tonight of a pastor and a scientist coming together. And my hope is that we will learn to think coherently about science and faith. Now, what we sometimes tend to do in our lives is we take different aspects of it and we park and we separate what we believe from the reality of the world around us. We stop thinking holistically and we lose coherence in the process. In other words, instead of our worldview, the way we think, instead of it being coherent, sharp, focused, we end up with all these disjointed, random pieces. And one of the areas that happens is science. And we separate our lives into science, where maybe we're a scientist or science gives truth, but religion and faith, well, it, tells us how to live, but it doesn't really say anything about the world. And what we want to do is unpack that. So Richard Dawkins, he's kind of one of my favorite guys because he constantly produces great quotes on the relationship between science and faith. He's kind of this angry, raging atheist. Not that all atheists are angry and raging. A lot of them are lovely and peaceful and awesome people to hang out with. But Richard Dawkins is just known for being a little bit irate. And he wrote a number of books, but here's a quote from him. He just lays it out there. He says this: "Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence." I obviously think that is patently and just woefully untrue. But the reality is that many of us actually think that way. We think faith is like a cop-out. We think faith is separate from what we believe about the world. And we're going to find tonight that that's not the case. So as we open our Bibles, I want to use Daniel chapter 2 as kind of a working text this evening. So to bring you into what's happening in Daniel chapter 2, it's a long chapter. I'm not going to read the whole thing, so I'm going to give you the summary here. Daniel chapter 2, you have the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. And basically, he's having these dreams. And he's become an insomniac. The king's not sleeping. He's getting increasingly angry because he's not sleeping. He's having these dreams. It's disturbing him. So he calls all the wise men in his kingdom. It says he calls the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to be summoned to him, to tell him what his dreams mean. Now, I should stop and say, when he summons the sorcerers and the enchanters and the Chaldeans, which were kind of like the religious people, we'd read that as modern Westerners, and we say, well, yeah, I mean, they're a bunch of superstitious Babylonians pulling people in. But I think we need to give more credit to the ancients. This is not the king pulling in a bunch of random superstitious people. This is the king pulling in the very best thinkers of his day. The wisest men, the people that had the most knowledge, that understood the world. And yeah, maybe they give them names that we scoff at today, but these were no children. They were wise men that wrestled with the mysteries of the universe. So they come to the king and they can't answer his dream. They can't explain why he can't sleep. If we think about this in modern terms, this is like an insomniac going to the sleep clinic, and the sleep clinic being unable to explain what has happened. That's a little bit what this was like. I can't understand what's going on, the wise men say to the king. In fact, they say, there's no one who can in all the kingdom. There's no one that understands the world well enough to explain to you what's going on. Check it out in verse 11 of chapter 2. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with the flesh. And just pause and let's just unpack this verse for a second. It says, no one can explain to you what's going on except the gods. But the gods don't care. The gods are distant. They're busy with their own troubles. They're busy fighting their wars and raging against each other and doing their thing. The gods, they don't dwell with us, so they're useless to us. So basically, king, you're hooped. There's nothing you can do. So the king threatens to destroy everybody. And in the midst of this, Daniel comes in. Now, Daniel was a Jew living in captivity, but he had gained favor. He had probably come from royalty in the past. And he had gained favor with the king. So he comes in and the king asks him, well, what are you going to do? And Daniel goes to his friends and says, guys, what are we going to do? So we pick it up. And Daniel prays to God and asks God for help. And it's Daniel's prayer I want to unpack this evening. Starting in verse 20. And Daniel answered and said, this is Daniel praying, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belongs wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise. For you have given me wisdom and might, and have made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. This seems like an interesting passage to base a talk about science and faith on. But you see, embedded in this prayer are three truths I want to unpack for you this evening that have fundamentally changed how we approach the created world as scientists, as arts experts, as artists, as painters, as accountants, as doctors. It changes how we approach the created world. So the first thing we see is in verse 21. Blessed be the name of the Lord forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. Blessed be the name of the Lord forever and ever. Now, when we contrast what Daniel prays compared to what the Chaldeans were praying, we notice something very significant. The God Daniel prays to is real, he is sovereign, and he is present. Daniel does not pray to a God who is distant and unconcerned with the world. He doesn't pray to a God that didn't even create the world. He prays to a God who is sovereign, who is Lord, who is king over everything. See, what Daniel does is he premises all of his knowledge, all of his understanding, all of his wisdom, all of his insights into the created world on the fact that there is a God and that he is good and that he is knowable. In other words, there is a God who is at the core of the universe. This truth, the fact that there is a God at the core of the universe, changes absolutely everything about science. And I'm going to submit to you this evening that more than changing everything about science, it makes science itself possible. Well, how does that work? See, Christianity and our belief in the fact that there is a God and that he is sovereign and in him dwells all power and might means that we have a source in which we can depend on for the universe. Now, in order for the universe to be something that we can study, in order that we look out at the created world and we expect knowledge to come back, when we wrestle with questions, there's two truths that we assume when we do that. The first truth is that the universe is rational. That when we do an experiment, when we study, when we research, that the universe actually makes sense. We're going to come back to this. And the second truth is that the universe is contingent. Now, this is a fancy philosophical word that basically means that the universe does not exist on its own. It's contingent on something else. And we know this, that the world does not just appear out of nothing. Nothing does not produce something. Something produces something. What we need to do to really grasp how significant this is, we need to take a journey back about 300-400 years to the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was the rise of scientific thinking, of rational thinking, the development of the scientific method that basically set humanity free from the shackles of the medieval ages, and all of a sudden, the capacity for thinking within the human race was unlocked. Now, if you read pop thinking or pop culture, or it seems like, we were all religious. We were all believers in kind of the superstitious God stuff, but then the Enlightenment happened and we were set free. We've been set free from this thinking, so now that we can realize that humanity is actually infinitely capable. But unfortunately, this is not backed up by the reality of history. See, at the core of the Enlightenment, every major scientist, almost without exception, every major thinker during the Enlightenment premised their research, premised their study of the universe on the fact that it was contingent on God, on the fact that at the core of everything was a God who was ordering it, who was directing it, and that as they studied it, they would discover something about God, that the universe was rational. Guys like Copernicus and Kepler, Boyle and Bacon and Isaac Newton, Galileo, Mendel, Pascal, Faraday. All the first-year engineering students are going, man, I hate those guys. Right, pretty much the bulk of modern science was formed by guys that premised all of their research on the fact that there is a God, that nothing is random, that the universe is ordered and directed. And this is what Daniel is praying. Blessed be the name of the Lord forever, because under him is all might and all power. The universe is his. Now you see, whenever we do something, whenever we go about an endeavor, it is premised upon what we can call unprovable axioms. Again, with the philosophical lingo. What that means is it's premised upon some assumptions about the universe, some assumptions about the world that we can't prove. In other words, whenever we start something, especially a scientific endeavor, it is premised on an act of faith. The most significant being faith that the universe is rational. Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. In other words, faith is assurance of what we hope to be true. This does not apply to religious people. This applies to everybody. This is a universal human truth that when we do things, we approach the world around us on some assumptions. See, we tend to think in pop culture that science produces proof. Science does not produce proof. Science produces evidence. And in doing so, produces theories that we test, and we test, and we test, and eventually chuck out and get a new one, and test, and test, and test. Because the reality is we can't prove without a doubt that anything is true, because every act of proof is premised upon an act of faith. When we struggle for a solution, when as scientists we open up our lab and we get into things, it is that act of wrestling with it and spending years and years and years studying is premised on the assumption that there's truth to be discovered in there. You can't prove when you set out to do something that there's going to be truth at the end of the rainbow, at the end of the journey. We simply have faith that it is so. Leslie Newbigin says this: without a passionate faith in the ultimate rationality of the universe, science would falter, stagnate, and die, as has happened before. Without a passionate faith in the ultimate rationality of the world, science would falter, stagnate, and die. Now, you might be thinking, well, Robin, this seems ridiculous. But the reality is, if you go back and you study history, you will find societies, whole groups of people that did not believe this to be true. The Greeks did not fundamentally believe the universe was rational. They believed it. If you go back many ancient cultures, you will see that, the world that we're experiencing is a product of the wars of the gods. In other words, the universe is not rational, it's arbitrary, it's random, it's contingent on some sort of whim of a god. See, faith is not blind. When we have faith as Christians, we don't put faith in something blind. We simply acknowledge that we need a starting point. And our starting point is that God is sovereign, that He is at the core of the universe. And because of that, when we study the world around us, we will discover truth. I'll give you an example. When we study one of the dominant theories and thought patterns of the world today, is that everything that we do as humans is a product of purely natural processes. Purely natural. Absolutely nothing determines what you as an individual do apart from the natural processes that formed your brain. And what's the governing process that determines that? The need for survival. And Alvin Plantinga, a famous Christian philosopher, has written at length about why this is problematic. And it's problematic because if everything in your brain is oriented towards the need for survival, how can you trust your own thoughts? See, at the end of the day, we're all putting faith in our knowledge. We're all putting faith in our reasoning capacity. We're putting faith in our senses that what we perceive about the universe is real. Faith is at the bedrock of everything. See, for this reason, science and faith are not at odds. They cannot be at odds. There was an idea presented that faith and science are separate magisteria, that they're unrelated, that they have nothing to do with each other. Science is concerned with truth and about the world, and religion is concerned with, values and facts. Max Planck, the famous physicist, says this: there can never be any real opposition between religion and science, for the one is the complement of the other. And he goes on, religion and natural science are fighting a joint battle in an incessant, never-relaxing crusade against skepticism, dogmaticism, unbelief, and superstition. And therefore, we pursue God. In other words, science and faith are not pursuing unrelated goals. They are pursuing the same goals of bringing truth, an adequate understanding of the world that we see around us. They're both pursuing the same thing when we talk about religion and science. They both seek to explain truth, reduce superstition, reduce skepticism, and introduce a clear-headedness to our experience. See, when we reduce faith and religion to just value judgments, what we're effectively doing is we're moving values into the realm of pluralism. You can believe whatever you want to believe. If you want to believe Jesus lived and died, that's great for you, but don't tell me about it. But unfortunately, fortunately for us, the reality of Jesus' life and death is not up for opinion. I mean, it's up for opinion in the sense you can think whatever you want to think. But it is either a historical fact or it's not. It can't be true for me and not true for you. And this is why Paul in Acts 17 says, he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead, saying, this Jesus, who I proclaim to you as the Christ. He's not talking about an idea. He's saying, look, no. We're not talking about values, guys. We're not talking about, arbitrary religious beliefs. We're talking about a historical fact. So point number one, that was an extended one. That was my biggest one this evening, but it allows us to move forward, is that all science is built upon faith. And for us, it is a faith that at the core of it, there is a God who is good. Number two, that the study of the universe reveals God's character to us. Check it out, verse 22 of Daniel's prayer. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. He reveals deep and hidden things. In other words, God is not just a God that is sovereign and mighty and over there. God is a God that is intimately involved with the world and revealing things to us. Paul unpacks this clearly in Romans chapter 1. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. In other words, the character and nature of God has been revealed to us via the things that have been made. So when we study the world, we're not just studying a world that is random. We're studying a world that reflects God. Now, this profoundly changes what we believe about science as Christians. This means that when we study science, when we wrestle with science, it cannot lead to contradictory beliefs between what we believe about the world and what we believe about God. God's revelation of himself in creation is consistent with creation as it is with Scripture. Now, this is the idea called dual revelation, that God reveals himself first generally through creation, and then specifically through the Scriptures and through the person of Jesus. Francis Bacon, who I already referenced, says this: there are two books laid before us to study to prevent our falling into error. First, the volume of Scriptures, which reveals the will of God, and then the volume of creatures, his creation, which express his power. This is beautiful, and it's challenging because it means that when we open up the Scriptures reveal God. And when we study creation through the means of science and the scientific method, it reveals the same God. We do not fear science as Christians. No, more than fear it, we embrace it. We celebrate it. We pursue it. We aim to be not just good at it, the very, very, very best at it. Because anything short of that is a failure to see that the world around us is revealing to us something about God. There's two profound ways that this happens. Two profound examples that I can give you of how this works. The first one is the idea of creation ex nihilo, which means creation out of nothing. So what we know about the world is that the world has a beginning. This is one of the profound developments in physics in the last 50 years. That the universe, that the world around us actually has a beginning. Now, every now and again on Facebook, you'll see an article pop up that talks about, hey, the universe doesn't have a beginning. And there was one this past week about how quantum fluctuations caused the beginning of the universe. And if you open up the article, you realize that it's just a deferral. We know the universe has a beginning. This is an established fact for us. Roughly 13 billion years ago, the universe was brought into existence out of, it seems to be, nothing. Charles Darwin, the man who developed the theory of evolution, says this: upon looking at the wonders of the universe, the wonders of the created world around him, he says this: I feel compelled to look to a first cause, having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous to that of man, and I deserve to be called a theist. In other words, when we study the world and we see that it has a beginning, the world around us cries out, there is a creator. There was a first cause, one who brought the universe into being out of nothing. Out of nothing. The same scientific tools that we use to arrive at this conclusion necessitate the existence of an unnatural, a supernatural being that transcends the laws of the created universe, that brings it into being out of nothing. The second kind of cool thing that we've discovered in the last 50 years about the created world is the idea of the Anthropic Principle. Now, what this means is that the world around us, the universe around us, seems to be so finely tuned that it is nothing short of a miracle that there is life on just one planet. Never mind all the other planets in the world. It is a miracle that there is life on even one planet. For example, if the universe was any smaller, if it had less mass, we would not have the formation of life. If the universe was any bigger, if it had more mass, we still would not have the formation of life. In other words, the universe needs to be as big as it is, have as much mass as it is, in order to sustain the creation of life. There needs to be enough radiation in the earth. There needs to be a moon. There needs to be a sun of just the right type. There's literally thousands and thousands and thousands of metrics that when we move them just one tiny percent, everything about the created world falls to pieces. There was a famous philosopher in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Probably the most famous atheist of the 20th century. He wrote a paper called Theology and Falsification. It was revolutionary. But towards the end of his life, he changed his mind. And he realized that he had spent his entire life as an atheist and he was wrong. And the thing that caused him to change his mind was not just philosophical thinking, although that was a part of it. The thing that ultimately caused him to change his mind was this anthropic principle. He says this: those scientists who point to the mind of God, in other words, those scientists who keep pointing to all these things that reveal that the world appears to be so carefully tuned so as to support life, do not merely advance a series of arguments or a process of syllogistic reasoning. Rather, they propound a vision of reality that emerges from the conceptual heart of modern science and imposes itself on the rational mind. And get this, he says this: it is a vision that I find compelling and irrefutable. The guy's name was Antony Flew. He ends up going on in his book, There Is a God, to say, he never quite came to faith in Christ. But he said, if there was anything that I was going to believe in, it would be in the resurrection of Jesus. It's a great book on the subject. So point number 2 is that science reveals the character and the nature of God to us. Point number 3 is that when we engage in this process, when we start to realize that our study and investment in the created world is a good thing, when we discover that it is connected to a God that is sovereign, we discover a life of purpose. Verse 23 of Daniel's prayer: to you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. He goes to God and he says, God, I give you praise, I give you thanks because you have given me something. I give you glory, I give you my life because you have given me something. This is the response that we have to the study of science. That when we open up the created world around us, we discover that there is a God that loves us, a God that created us, that compels us to continue to study, to continue to invest, to continue to seek cures for cancer, to continue to advance the medical sciences and the engineering sciences and the environmental sciences and whatever. See, this is not just a byproduct of the fact that God reveals himself. It is an embedded part of our created nature. That when God starts to reveal things to us out of the created world, we can't help but cry out in praise because that's the way God made us. Genesis 1. God creates humanity. He says this, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Your option as a Christian cannot be a life of, whatever, the created world doesn't matter. That is not an option that you have. God created you to go out and fill the world and subdue it. In other words, understand it, wrestle with it, study it, become an expert in it. This isn't to say that everyone needs to go out and get their PhD in some obscure field of biology. Lord knows that's not what I'm doing. But this is to say that we, as a community, as the church, and as individuals in the church, we treasure and we value the sciences. And we find joy and purpose in it, because as we do that, we are fulfilling our created purpose. The Apostle Paul modeled this. He, more so than almost anybody else in the scriptures, was philosophically robust. If you study the scriptures, he's constantly quoting modern philosophers of the day and turning their arguments against them. He spoke every relevant language of the time. In other words, he did whatever it took to reach the people around him. He became an expert. He became one who understood the world. In other words, he became what was effectively, he probably wouldn't have used the term, he became an anthropologist and a sociologist. He studied people, he studied behavior, and he wrote and he spoke into it. This is our calling. Now, what we tend to do is we tend to take this too far as a society. We lose sight of the glory of God within it. In Ecclesiastes 12, there's a conversation happening between a wise man and a student. And it says this, my son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and of much study is weariness of the flesh. You all are saying, yeah, tell me about it. Of much study is the weariness of the flesh. In other words, do not build your identity, the core of who you are, upon scientific advancement. It is good, it is glorious, but it does not define you. Our worth as individuals is not defined by how brilliant we are, by how glorious our thinking, by how many papers we publish, by how smart we are at arguing and debating. The speaker goes on and he says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Fear God and keep his commandments. See, we get to approach the scientific world with a freedom, with a joy that says, hey, you know what? When we do this, it's going to be awesome. God's going to reveal something about himself. We're going to discover truth because there is a God at the helm of the universe guiding and leading it, who cares about the world, who incarnated himself into the world.